So, what are we talking about today, Jodah?
Well, Dan, I think I'd like to talk about the interview process. Um, and this is a sort of a area that is of interest to, I think, me and probably everybody out there. But what I'd like to do is there's tons of videos out there about how to go about um, doing an interview when you're trying to get a job. There's plenty of information out there about the type of shirts you should wear, the sorts of ways you should act inside an interview, and all of those are probably going to be extraordinarily helpful for anybody looking for a career or looking for a job out there. But what I'm particularly interested in today is the other side of the interview process, and that is the interviewer process. Um, Dan, I think both of you and I have in our work have conducted interviews ourselves, and obviously,
Many.
yeah, right. And then obviously, looking for work at times, I've had the classic Silicon Valley life where I've gone on to many interviews, and so and those experiences have at times left me questioning the whole process. I mean, all the way down to, is it even an effective way of doing it? Um and I have my reservations around the approaches of the interview in general, and some of them are just sort of indicative of sort of my personality and how I think about things, and not unlike kind of the conversation that we had with Young last week about the way we identify the relationships between um, organizations and the people that work for them. But some of them I think are actually also a little more less subjective. I think there are things that, from a company's perspective, if they thought about it, they would also consider that some of these areas problematic in the interview process. And I'm just going to say this. My thesis is this, Dan. This is and we can take it from here. My thesis is that I think the artifice of the interview gets in the way more than it should in allowing companies to hire for the right person, and that if they hire the right person, it is independent of the interview mechanics. And I'm talking specifically the mechanics, because there are people who are great interviewers, who have their built-in mechanisms. But I'm talking about the way interviews are structured and the multiple ways the interviews are structured. And I've talked about this. And we can kind of go into this. The mechanics themselves don't lend themselves. They're almost despite the fact of whether you can hire somebody appropriate for your company. Um, and that's my thesis. That's what I want to talk about today.
All right. Well, listeners, you are listening or watching, if you're on YouTube, the Sense and Signal podcast with Dan and Jodah. And it's a podcast about leadership and sense making. And please hit the subscribe button if you enjoy this conversation. Yeah, Jodah, I agree. Um, I come from the other end. I work in higher education, and I've been in the same at the same school, college, for about 15 years. But I have been on probably hundreds of interviews at this point. Well, I won't say that many, but I've been on a lot of interviews, and I've conducted a lot of interviews. I've been on hiring committees, and I've been the hiring manager for quite a few folks. Um, so I'm familiar with both sides of the table, and I'll agree with you. I find the whole process artificial. And actually, I think I said that yesterday when I had an interview. I had an interview yesterday, and I was supposed to do a presentation, and they asked me to do it one way, and I said, "Well, this is such an artificial process. Anyhow, I'm just going to do this my way, and
Yeah,
this is what I'm going to do to
yeah,
show you today."
yeah.
Um, I guess I know you want to talk about the interviewer process rather than interviewee process, although it's a kind of a symbiotic relationship. I feel like at this point, I'm at a point in my career, in my life, where I'm gonna enjoy the interview. I'm gonna try and enjoy the interview process, because I'm not necessarily desperately looking for a job or a new position right now in my life. So when I go in, it's kind of exploratory for me. Sometimes I even say, and I did that at another recent interview I had recently. Where I said, I go on interviews sometimes to do research about what the competition's doing or about what other people are doing, and bring those ideas back to my own organization. So I don't know if that's a good thing to say or not. I know it could be problematic in some industries, but I'm kind of, I hate interviewing, but I'm finding a way to find joy in it.
No, and I think you and I are in the same wavelength. And I think, and I think I do believe that there is a bit of an understanding out there around in the various fields that the process has, not that it's broken, but it's originally derived from an old school power structure. And I think that these newer organizations, with because of the modern world we're in, are starting to recognize that, and they're making changes. And one of those changes is definitely group this sort of group aspect of interview. And you and I both have talk about that. We can go deeper into that around our issues
The
around that,
committee
the
process.
committee process. But that is meant to be a democratizing effect, right? That comes from a spirit of goodness. I gotta believe. It feels like to me, it's like, hey, we're gonna have the team decide whether you come on board. Now, there's issues there, and we can talk about that. But before we go into that, and before I go on a monologue, which Dan and I have agreed, no more monologues in our conversations.
for the
um,
for
I'm
our
gonna
repeat listeners, the few that we have out there.
so let's I got this little definition of an interview for those who have never done an interview before. And this is what I have here. I'll read it off verbatim. An interview is a goal or task oriented talk for gathering information where the interviewer questions and the interviewee answers, with a sequential structure of question, answer, question, answer. The interviewer's main goal is to access information from the interviewer, or excuse me, the interviewee. This information should fuel understanding and, in the case of hiring, decisions. And I find some weaknesses in that definition, and I'm not saying that is necessarily the best
Well, you're
definition.
trying to pull information out of a person to, you know, to determine if they're going to be if they're going to be able to accomplish the goals you have for the position that you're hiring them for. Um, and I know the term fit is problematic. Some people say we shouldn't use terms like "Are they a good fit for a company?" But you know, I think the truth is there is also that aspect to, are they going to fit into the culture of the organization? That's hard to determine during an interview because it is an artificial process.
What's the
Um,
problem with the word fit? And I'm not, and I could kind of understand. I could,
I've just heard that in passing,
yeah,
and I've kind of chalked it up to, well, that's one perspective on interviewing, but
sure,
it makes sense that you know sometimes it's good to bring people into an organization who might not be a perfect fit,
right,
right?
right,
Because
absolutely, yeah.
you don't want to become stagnant. You don't want to get into groupthink. And so you don't want to become, yeah, so you want to bring some diversity of thought into your organization. And I think it's about diversity, really. Oh, there is not going to be a good fit for us, but maybe it's that you have some sort of bias. And I think that's another aspect of hiring that um, we can go into later on in this conversation, but the bias aspect and how we get around that during the interview process too.
Yeah, there is definitely a lot of bias, and that's interesting. And I agree. And really, the, when you, as a company, you're looking to find people that can perform certain roles and tasks, and you're looking hopefully for the person who will do what you expect or what you need the best, right? And so
Yeah.
that's where the fitness comes into play. But and the other spectrum, like you said, there's also happy accidents where the unexpected, you weren't asking for that particular magic, but this person brought something even more to your organization than you
Oh,
were
that's what you're always hoping for, right?
right, a special, yeah, something cool, something new, something innovative, something that sparks the people around them to be surprised and excited too. Um, and so fundamentally, that's your goal, right? Is to find that person who's gonna come into your company, integrate inside, um, align with your business goals, and organizational goals and needs. Um,
Solve problems that you did not know you had.
Solve problems you didn't know you have. That is huge, right? I mean, because you know the
Yeah.
problems you need solved, but there's problems that you're unaware of, and to have that person come in and identify those, and and the organization, well, hopefully, it wants that, right?
Oh, I would hope so. I certainly, from all employees, new or veteran, I appreciate people who take the initiative to identify problems I'm not even aware of and solve them before I'm even aware it's a problem. Right. So, and I will applaud that to no end. I definitely appreciate it. I've had people like that who are really good at that kind of thing. And
Absolutely.
those are the gems. Those are the diamonds that you're trying to collect in your organization.
Yeah, and we're not necessarily discussing about great performance of workers here in this conversation. And
Right.
and when you say gems, um, uh,
And I would say, getting back to the interview process, sometimes I would say, in my experience, sometimes you don't necessarily see that in the hiring process initially. Sometimes that person's hired and they're there, and then they just kind of emerge, and you weren't expecting it either. So,
yeah, yeah,
again, it gets back to the artificiality of the hiring process and all its dimensions. It's tough. How do you hire good people, and how do you screen them to make sure that they do have the competencies and skills to do the job that you need them to do, and that they also have the character to be a good contributor to your organization, not to cause problems, to be collaborative and supportive, and these are things that you're looking for. But can you always identify it in an interview process? I mean, I have learned there are red flags in an interview process. I've learned as a hiring manager to always trust your gut, you know, and that seems nebulous and biased in itself. But if every time I haven't trusted my gut, I've been burned.
interesting. But unfortunately, you can't, and that goes so. So again, my thesis is the mechanics of the
Yeah.
interview process are inefficient or insufficient. But yes, you can be a people person where you're able to read people, and there's training that can go around that. And so let's just kind of
Well, let's talk about when you say inefficient. So, what part of the hiring process do you think is inefficient? Is it the interview questions? Is it the dialogue that happens one on one or in a committee format? What aspect do you not think is effective?
so so I would say that all those parts are probably have a level of inefficiency. I think fundamentally this, especially through the committee process, um, before you had the committee process, you had people who were sort of tasked with hiring. That was kind of their thing, right? And now you have this
Kind of
committee
HR.
right. Sure. And now you have this committee process. And I would argue that you've introduced inefficiencies through that process. And what the inefficiencies are is that the process of interviewing is a skill unto itself. And to be able to elicit the right information from people, to get the accurate information from people, is a special skill. Right, there are people who train for years to be able to interview in interviews, like on podcasts or on there's a skill to that, and
We
to
should take that course.
we should probably take that course. And that by just having your engineer and your marketing person and then come on in and do that and have that be so heavily weighted, I think introduces a level of inefficiency because these aren't professional interviewers. Now, that's not to say that they can't be inherently good at it for one reason or another. You can, but again, what I'm saying is that there's no system to make them good at. You're not going to get repeat success from that process by introducing a bunch of different people into it. You're actually going to add chaos to the system. That you're lucky if you happen to grab 5 people from your department who interview, who also know how to interview, and then be able to identify the best candidate, right? And then you're also, through getting all those people, introducing probably certain levels of biases that are occurring because of internal aspects of the organization that are
Oh yeah,
sometimes
yeah,
are hard to
and
overcome,
external,
and
and
external, right?
external.
So, and those things can
So
be accounted for.
I got a question because when you describe this, it's a little bit foreign to me coming from higher ed. Like, so when we do a committee interview in higher ed, the interview questions are usually scripted well in advance of the interview, and for equity purposes, uh, the committee members are encouraged to stick to the script. Like, there's no improvisation for the most part. to that script of questions, and they're assigned in advance, and everyone agrees on the questions. And I believe even in some cases, HR vets the questions before they're asked too. So it goes through some levels of screening. Is that not how it happens in the .com industry?
Not typically. Not
Oh,
I
fascinating.
would say, and in fact, let me read. Let me. I was looking at some people. I was going through some documentation around how to conduct a good interview, and this one person wrote these three things, and she just wrote. She said, first, before you are going to conduct an interview, consider your goals. Like, what are your goals for the hiring of this person? Two, do some background research so you aren't redundant. You don't ask that person questions that are unnecessary because you could have found out, hey, by the way, what's your name? And then three, organize your questions. And I think it's kind of in the zone what you're talking about. Structure your questions and also make them repeatable for each person so you have a basically controlled variables, right? Now, I'm not sure how much I agree or disagree with all of that. I'm a personal fan of kind of shooting from the hip a little bit, but I get the sentiment of that. And no, I would say that from in the industry that I'm in, I've rarely experienced an interview that would feel like it was probably derived. And I have never conducted an interview with it. I've never submitted a list of questions to an HR to see. It's like, hey, Joda, we need to interview this person. Okay, here's your time slot. Go on in. And then I ask questions, and
Oh, interesting.
yeah. So no, there isn't
Well, I think
that.
it's more with it's different with one on one, right? With one on one, you're not required to do that. But I know in the committee processes, so in higher education, for those listening, when you apply for a job in higher ed, your application and resume gets screened by HR. If you pass through and you have the qualifications for the position, then you get screened by a hiring committee. It could be anywhere from 3 to 4 up to 10 people. If you're going for a more administrative, a leadership role, it's going to be more. You're going to have a larger committee that you're going to be interviewing with because there's more stakeholders. And in that case, the questions are scripted in advance, and then each person takes their turn asking the question. They don't deviate from the questions, and they want to make it consistent so each applicant has the same experience as best as possible. So it's more fair and it's more equitable.
That's right. And there's
And
biases that you could introduce if like there was somebody that you inherently thought for whatever reason was probably a better fit for no good reason other than because they wore the same shirt you were wearing, you might ask softer questions. And so by introducing the same questions, you're building in that regiment that you're going to make it equitable for each person.
exactly, um, and then and then if you go to the second level interview, you know. Then you'll interview. Then it's more free form where the hiring manager um, is able to improv the questions a little bit more. There's more to it than that in higher ed. If depending on if you're going up higher in the hierarchy of the organization, because then there are times where you might interview or do a session with different stakeholders at the campus, different group interviews and sessions like that too. So you might be have to do a presentation for like 20 or 30 people or something, But so there are some variants, but yeah, I do. I have mixed feelings about the committee process in higher ed. I feel like committees, getting back to evolution, like we talked about last week with Young. I think having a group of people makes it a little bit more tribal because the organizations that you work within are often very tribal in a sense, and having the tribe be able to select the people they want to come into their group, I think there's some power to that, but I also feel like it's problematic because in its own way, it introduces a lot of bias. You can have very strong members of a committee skew the whole process if it's not managed carefully.
Yeah, and that's one of the complaints that people have around these committees. And again, why you have a structured language and questions so that it doesn't get skewed by one person. Um, the again, I firmly believe, and I actually like the idea of bringing people into personally, and this by no means it's right of bringing the team into the conversation, but it does seem that the way it's handled today, it can cause, as I mentioned, as I stated, inefficiencies where it can derail a perfectly good interview because of the things that you just stated. And these aren't, again, I I think the fundamental is hiring is a skill. Looking for understanding what is it you need is a leadership question, and then what you're thinking is that your team understands and are aligned with the leadership needs or the company needs. Right? It shouldn't be what Jodah needs or what Dan specifically, unless you're the leader or you're aligned with the business for one reason or another. But it's something that the company needs or that department needs, and so it's a leadership decision. And I don't mean from a person perspective, but from just the concept, right? It's like it needs to have a goal. Why you're hiring this person, and not everybody might understand that. They might not get it. They might not know what is exactly needed, and so again, I think you should. I love the idea of bringing the team members into for the conversation, but right now it feels heavily weighted towards that team conversation and less aligned with the needs of the spot and perhaps the direction of the company is the alignment. And this is both me being historically an interviewer and the interviewee. I see it time and time again that there's the unstructure can cause some problems with this sort of committee approach.
Yeah, and in my years, and I've been on many committees, hiring committees, and I've been on the other side of the table too. I have to admit, I find the committee process highly problematic as well, for the reasons that we've already kind of gone over. And I would like to see more innovative ways of getting to know candidates, and things that I've heard about and read about that interest me are like team hiring, like where you get a group of people into a room and you're interviewing them as a team and giving them some sort of task that they must complete. You're observing them. I'm kind of interested in experimenting with those methods of hiring. Um, because I think there's potential to actually learn how people operate. Like, so going back to the interview I had yesterday, when they wanted me to do a presentation, and instead of doing the presentation, I kind of did a presentation about how I would do the presentation that they had asked me to do because they were only giving me 10 minutes. And I was like, well, I'm not going to be able to do what you want me to do in 10 minutes. So I'm just going to tell you how I would do it. And I prepared a PowerPoint. And I thought when I was developing, I was like, I'm actually giving you something better than the presentation that you
Yeah,
asked
yeah,
for, in my mind at
yeah.
least. Maybe they disagree. But I'm giving you how I'm going to think through what you've asked me to do. So I'm not just going to try and convince this group of people to jump onto this project. I'm going to talk you through how I'm going to think through strategically how I'm going to convince that group of people to join this initiative that you want them to join, and how I'm going to think about the data, how I'm going to think about creating strategic alliances with other people in the organization to build trust and buy into the people I'm trying to appeal to. And I think that's actually, so sometimes I think, when we give out instructions for the hiring process, who knows? Odds are I probably will never hear from them again. They're probably going, that guy is crazy. But I think sometimes, if and I get this is coming from a place of privilege, right? Because I'm not desperately looking for a job right now. But if you are, it's harder to take a chance like that. But if you can, why not every once in a while take a chance if you got an interview and
Well,
just kind
I
of
don't think
see
it's a.
what you want?
I just don't think it's a chance. I think that's kind of the point I'm coming from, is that I think this highly regimented structure of an interview process, and when I say regimented, they can have an artificial um, veneer of being casual, right? Hey, let's just chat, let's just talk, But in the end, they're looking for something specific. And one of the things that I think that I don't like about the interview process is the interview process is heavily weighted towards performance, and they ask you to perform. And I don't necessarily, short of you actually, like, you are going to be an actor, and so hey, perform. For a lot of people, doing the job and performing are two different things. And so I will, in my field, leverage like an engineer. The idea of asking the engineer to have to perform when that's not their forte. Their forte is writing code. That you need a better structure than that. And now I've never been in an engineering interview, and I'm assuming that the interview structure is probably pretty cool. I've heard that they'll have like these coding tests and stuff like that. But all I'm saying is, like, I think there's a heavy aspect to a performance aspect to interviewing, and I get it. We are human beings. It's all about the performance. We are trying to communicate and understand each other, and we create personas, and we engage with people in various ways and differently in different environments. So we're not going to get out of that. So I'm not asking to get out of that, but I think for a company who's trying to hire the best person, oftentimes, and I'm not saying every time, because there's great people who just intuit, can ask the right questions, they understand what they're trying to interview for, and it's, again,
Some people are really good
it's
interviewers.
despite the mechanics is all I'm saying. They have their own internal mechanics, but and they're great. But I'm gonna argue that companies often will be hiring the best interviewer, not necessarily the person for the best job.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. Or I would also say the danger of the committee structure is it does introduce biases from a lot of different people on the committee, and that sometimes that can skew you to maybe the more mediocre candidate. Because I do know people get on committees in an effort to make sure that they're screening their boss to make sure it's not going to be someone who's going to challenge the status quo, right? Or that the person's going to behave in a certain way that they want them to behave or whatever. So, and I think I think on an administrative level, people are interviewing for administrative jobs know that, so they're coming in extra friendly than they would normally be. So it's all an artificial process, and I think it kind of makes me get to the whole question of what are we hiring for? I mean, what? I mean, we need people to do certain jobs, and what is the risk? What is the risk of making a bad decision? Um, and the risks can be very serious, right? Depending on the program that you're hiring for, um, because I can't get into details, but I'm thinking about a position at where I work where the wrong person got hired, and now the program that they were supposed to lead and kickstart is in dire circumstances, and
Yeah,
it's
I've heard.
grant funded, so we might lose it, right?
Yeah, and I've heard other things. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about this podcast that we were going to do, and he was a lawyer, and he said very similarly. They had done interview with this one person, and this person was, on paper and in interview, was just the perfect fit. They hired this person, and right away they were like, "Oh, this person had great talking points, but was not able to, did not have the experience to perform the role as they said they could." And so, like I said, I think that the whole idea of the interview structure gears itself to being gamed, allowing for people who are great, who spend tons of time becoming a great interviewer or interviewee or applicant, and they can game the system. And certain jobs, that gaming might actually be beneficial, right? And there might be certain roles that actually, where that's a beneficial.
Sales.
But we're not saying sales are particularly, but the ability to be able to convince somebody, right? Because as an engineer or an architect or a structural engineer, it shouldn't necessarily revolve around ultimately convincing. Although I'm sure there always is aspects of it, but there's also a fundamental truth to what you're trying to say as well. And it might not be your number one strength, but in the interview process, at least in my experience, it's a lot of it's about convincing. And I get it. Again, we're human beings. We do try to convince each other, and there's a bit of a sales part aspect to life. That's let's just say there's that. There is a in life. There's always some level of sales, but push that down. That's the
Yeah, yeah,
baseline.
yeah.
Getting above that baseline. So I do think that the interview process injects way too much of the sales pitch aspect into it. And the other thing
And because of that pressure, people come in and don't perform their best because they're hyper nervous, right?
that's right.
Um, and so I think it is important to have empathy for the interviewee, so that you're making them at ease, so that they
Applicant,
can
yeah.
perform the best they can. Because I've had interviews, God, that have just been nightmarish, honestly. Where I felt like it was on the other side of the table that was, where I've gotten sent the wrong Zoom link or told the wrong time to show up for an
Oh
interview.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
then people are kind of crusty, or, you know,
Like it's your
or
fault or something like that, right?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and then I'm kind of like trying to scramble and get recentered. And you just never get your footing back.
And
Yeah,
that was one
I
of the
mean,
things. One of the things, like I think I sent you a link where the gentleman was saying, come from a position of empathy. Where are they coming
yes.
from as the applicant? Where's the applicant coming from? Do they? I mean, what's their mental framework? Just because they're nervous, because they flub the words, because they're not eloquently explaining their position at that very moment, doesn't mean that they can't eloquently explain their position at all. And it might be because of the interviewer, right? They could be doing stuff. And yes, you could say, well, then they're failing and I need them. Well, what are you looking for from that person? Are you looking for a person to be able to be excellent and do the job a good chunk of the time, or a person who at that very moment satisfies all your interviewer needs, and so that you feel like they've done a job at that very moment. You're not looking for the moment. You're looking for the future. And so
Yeah, you're looking for potential.
you're looking for potential. And so it's very important that you, as an interviewer, maintain an extraordinary level of empathy and active listening. It should be an investigation slash conversation. And if your interviewer isn't providing with the information, then make no haste in asking them to clarify their position on some things. Do not
Well,
make
yeah,
them dance around and try to find your needs. And I think that happens a lot. I feel that oftentimes in interviews, I've been in a lot of interviews where it's like, tell us about something, and you do your thing, and you might not hit the exact note that they were looking for. Well, it shouldn't
what?
be a Rorschach test. It should be you should be able to
Yeah,
identify what your needs are and have them answer to them. And I think a lot of that gets lost in these sort of really nice kind of conversational interviews.
like I had an interview question like, what if you had to make a controversial decision, and how did you manage the response to it? And I was like, well, I don't know. I get good buy-in from my team, so by the time we come to a decision, there's lots of consensus. So it's not necessarily controversial. So I don't know how I can respond to that question. It
Yeah.
presumes that I'm kind of an authoritarian,
Right,
right?
right.
That I'm not going to go through a process of collaboration and data collection and sense making with the group, so that we're all on board with the direction we're going in, which is the way I manage, at least. So I tend not to get a lot of angry colleagues coming after me lately, at
Yeah.
least.
Yeah, no, that's it, because I have too been asked many times in my experience, tell me about that time that you had a conflict with somebody. And again, I don't want to go into the specifics here. My general thought on this conversation is just around the artifice of the conversation, and the identification of what it is that you're truly looking for, right? So get through the cruft of the BS that you've been told that you should care about. But that question does come up a lot, right? Like, how do you handle conflict is the question. And short of me saying, oh, I pull out my big knife and I stab everybody in the heart, it's an interesting question, and it does seem to be one of those questions that there's short of you can go online and find good answers to that question. And so once again, to me, it's like kabuki theater. Find the right answer. And so why even ask the question? Have a better question. Ask a question that's interesting, not that one, because it's a kabuki theater question at this point in time. It's again, it's artifice. You're trying to find the right person for the job. There'll be times when that person fails in a conflict situation. There'll be times when they excel in a conflict situation.
The
Ask that question. How, like, ask about how the process of conflict works. How do you work with conflict? Instead of trying to identify a specific situation and have them come up with the perfect answer that you're looking for.
well, though I would say, in response to that, it's interesting. I was talking to a colleague of mine who's in a, I won't say who it is because they were in a very prominent position in Portland, actually. Um, and we were talking about interviewing and hiring and stuff like that. And he said the thing he always looks for in interviews, and this is coming from him as the interviewee, is the fear in the question that's being asked. And he was saying, like, he could tell what the team was looking for from him or the successor for the next position because they were trying to prevent something from happening
Oh
that
yeah,
had happened with the previous person.
100%. Like it's fishing, right? Like
Yeah.
they're fishing for an issue. And me being in my profession, a UX person, I get so many fishing questions. You can feel them right away, and a lot of it is like that. I'm not going to go into specifics because the audience isn't going to care, but they get very specific and like, oh, that's a fishing question because you guys obviously have an issue in this area and you want to know. And you know what? Honestly, I don't find anything wrong in that question. Again, I don't want to say that
No, I don't think it's
there's
wrong. I
nothing
mean, they
wrong in
need
that
to
question.
know.
There's nothing wrong in that question. What I am saying is like there are these certain questions out there that add to the level of artifice and be very specific. Identify your goals of your interview. Figure out the kinds of questions and the kinds of information you're looking for, and very clearly kind of articulate those. And as we said, have the sort of empathy and patience for the person to finally kind of get to the answer that you're looking for. Work with them, right? Because the idea that they're going to just be able to dance themselves into the exact spot, because in my field, there's many approaches, I'll put it this way, there's many levels, there's many lenses you can approach a specific problem in. And the question is, what lens are you asking for? And I can lens it from this perspective. That might not be what they're asking for. And if they leave it
Oh
at
yeah,
that,
no,
they're going to walk.
I've got
Go.
a great example, right? I've got a great example of the empathy thing. So, an interview I went to a while ago, they asked a question about sustainability, right? And I said, well, I asked a clarifying question before I responded. I was like, well, do you mean sustainability as environmental, global climate change sustainability, or do you mean fiscal, financial sustainability? And the person obviously didn't know. They were in a committee. And so they said, answer it however you want. So I started with environmental sustainability. It was on my mind, and I thought it could apply. And so I started talking. They let me go for 2 minutes before they finally interrupted and said, "No, we mean financial
It's
sustainability."
ridiculous. It's
And
ridiculous.
then I'm like, and I will say that particular group, and this is the other thing. This is my axe to grind about the interview process: is just being straight up unprofessional with the whole freaking process. Because that group didn't even. I didn't get a second interview, but they never even emailed me to let me know I wasn't going to get a second interview.
Well,
It's just like, hi, thanks. We wasted an hour of your time. We treated you rudely throughout the process, and then we're not even going to tell you you're not going to go to the next level. It's just, I find so much of that in my field where the colleges, I know, I have a colleague who found out she was a finalist for a vice president position at a college. She found out through a text message from a friend that she didn't get the final position because the college had emailed out to everyone the person they had selected, and they had never bothered to tell her before they made the announcement. And she had, gone through a whole series of interviews at that point.
so
I mean,
I just want to say that Dr. Dan is fired up, and this is why I asked Dr. Dan to drink a beer before we do this show.
this year you're now getting into my my axe to grind because
Grind.
I have
So
I once. So here's another one.
oh
As
my
far as
goodness!
I
All
know, you
right.
have your thing.
No,
Let me just
I have
bitch
nothing.
for a
I
second,
have nothing.
Joda.
All right, all right, all
No,
right.
I gotta get my jug now because Joda wants me to drink beer during the show. I'm gonna drink some beer, and I'm pouring this beer now, trying to spill it on my desk.
Sounds good.
And it's a good amber. I
Mm-hmm.
get it up at my local pub,
You want to do a name drop on
and
the pub? What's your pub called?
Drumlin, the Drumlin,
Okay,
up here in Shoreline, in Washington. They have excellent microbrews. Hmm.
looks good. Nice head. I like
So
it.
I had an interview. It was in, I'm going to say the state at least. It was in Texas, and it was for a dean's position. And they asked me to come. I'd interviewed first online, and then they waited like 2 months to get back to me and said, "Oh, can you come to Texas for this interview?" I was like, "Sure." And then they waited a whole nother week to start scheduling my trip. And they didn't get my plane ticket booked until the day before I was supposed to leave, and then had me flying in at midnight in the Dallas Fort Worth. And said, "Oh, you're gonna have to take an Uber for like an hour to your hotel, and then we'll pick you up there, at 10 o'clock in the morning." And I was like, "I'm not going to this interview." I mean, I'm personally at that point where I'm just like, if you treat me rudely during the interview process, I'm just gonna say bye.
Well,
Because
look.
you have to have some
Let me
self-respect at
let
some point.
let's talk about that for a second. So I got a list of things to talk to that, like the way to solve some, not solve, but to approach some things. But you bring up, so again, this kind of goes back to last week's conversation a little bit. What's the relationship between the applicant and the job? So historically, it was one of, I don't want to use this word because it sounds, there's a better word for it, but there was a hierarchical structure. You want that job, they have the power, you've got no power. And whether that's right or wrong, or no, excuse me, whether that is the truth, in the way the world works right now, doesn't mean that it's right. It doesn't mean it's necessarily right. And I think that we're in a world where we should start to explore the relationship between a person who works for an organization, works with, I like to use the word now, works with an
With the
organization,
organization. I like that too.
and the organization that is able to leverage your capabilities. And this is very privileged, but it shouldn't be. All right, it shouldn't. This is Joda's opinion. We've got moved into opinion now, and this is Joda's opinion. It shouldn't be. It should not. Anybody who works at Safeway, who works at Target, who works at the gas station, they should be considered working with the people who own that company. And I don't want to get into the notion of ownership or anything. That's a whole other conversation. But I like to think that we are in a world where we can start to explore this relationship. So you, from my vantage point, you should be interviewing them as much as they're interviewing
Oh,
you.
for sure. And that's what employers need to recognize. It is a two-way street. I am, as if a person coming in to interview for the job is screening you as much as you're screening them. And
Yeah.
like that Texas job, the reason I backed out is like, you guys clearly don't have your act together, and so if it's going to be like that working there, I don't need to go work for some dysfunctional organization. Um, and I don't think, I think you're right. There is this kind of um, old school mentality that needs to change around. Okay, we're the hierarchy. People should be grateful to come work for us. Well, no. There's competition. There are other options. I could become a YouTube star and,
We're already there. We're
and make my
famous.
living there.
We're famous.
No, we're famous. Joking all aside, I mean, I could do something else, right? I could flip burgers. I don't know, but I'm not going to go work for an organization that's going to be abusive. And I think you do as an employee. I think going back, because I know the focus of this is not on the interviewee, although it's a symbiotic relationship. You can't have one without the other. But the interviewers need to recognize that. Like, I once got called in. I was another horror story. I got called in for an I was a finalist for a position, and the hiring manager called me in for a third interview that was not on the books. It was kind of like this secret interview. And so I was like, I tried to like connect with them personally, like, what are you really looking for from this person in your new department, right? And they said loyalty. And I was just like, God, that's such a awful answer to that question, because I'm trying to get really into what you're really looking for. I'm not looking for your rant about why you want loyalty and you're pounding your fist in your palm and stuff like that, because I'm not going to give you loyalty. You're going to earn my loyalty if you want it, but I'm not just going to come in and hand you my loyalty.
That's a very strange response. Loyalty. That's sorry. That sounds like a for it sounds like a Trump response or like
It is. It is a very Trump response. Yeah. And it's a red flag. So if someone asks you that question, if you're an interview and you ask, do you have any questions for me? And someone asks you a question like that, that's not the response that we're looking for, right? You want to show some respect to the employee or the person you're trying to bring onto your team,
well, I
because
mean,
again, we are interviewing you as
right,
much as you are interviewing us.
right. I mean, when you say you want, I mean, I think that it's about the philosophy of the company and the philosophy of the employment ecosystem, um, and we're trying to change that, right? I mean, some people there's things are changing, and the outlook of or the way we engage with organizations, I hope are will and are changing. There are people out there who are trying to make things happen, and so and I think that the interview process is that front door of that change. I mean, I would argue that I feel I have been abused in certain interviews, and I'll say not necessarily in the process itself, although I feel obviously at times in my 25 years everybody's been in bad interviews. This is not new, right? But
Oh yeah.
but there's no reason why we can't fix it. Um, I mean, where my abuse has often come from my industry is the time abuse, where they say, "Hey, you know what? We're going to take as much time as we want to interview you." And I have recently started to stop, saying yes to those interviews. I remember I interviewed for AOL uh after their heyday, right? I was looking to see like maybe kind of join them to like
You got to interview with some
they
dinosaurs.
were dinosaurs. When I say after, it was probably around 2002 or three, but they were,
Okay, so they weren't that
they
old,
were
that
about Time
long.
Warner, but no, but we're talking about Silicon Valley years, so
Yeah.
they were going south. Maybe it was 2005, but they had me come in uh 2 days, 2 whole days of interviewing, 8 hours almost each day. I didn't get the job, but um,
God,
but it was just
such.
when it was all said and done, it felt so abusive on some level. That was where I was thinking, I mean, and I will say this here on this video. This is my philosophy. This is my thinking. I think there should be legislation in this area that I believe that the interviews should no interview should be longer than 3 hours at all. And if you want, and that legislatively, if the interview is longer than 3 hours, that you have to pay that person commensurately against the job that they're actually hiring for. So if that job is, and so
Well, I
that
guess it depends on the job, right? I mean, I
no,
know in
I don't.
higher,
I don't think it should. You should be able to make a decision in 3 hours. I think of that person's time,
I
but
guess it depends on how many stakeholders you have
but
to
but
involve.
but if you need more stakeholders, you're allowed to, but you now have to start paying that person. I'm not saying you can't have an all week interview, but you cannot be painless. That you have to put
I could see that.
some
I could see
reverse
that.
pain on the organization to do such things, though, is what I'm saying. They need to feel it now at this point as well. They don't get all that for free. I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm not saying it should be illegal. All I'm saying is that after 3 hours, you have to start paying that person for their time. That is all I'm saying.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair, because I mean, the higher up you go in an organization, and the higher level of job that you're applying for, it requires longer days to go through the interview process, because they're trying to include all the different stakeholders to make sure
Then
there's
you have to pay.
some level of
Then I say you
consensus.
just have
Yeah,
to
no,
pay.
I agree.
And
I
if you made
agree.
it past the 3 hour mark and you're on that final point where you're gonna have to interview for another 10 hours, you got to pay that person for those 10 hours. And when you say it's high, like I said, I wasn't interviewing for some manager position at AOL. I was there for like, it wasn't 16 hours, but it was probably between the 2 days, it was probably about 14 hours. This wasn't a manager position. This is just a general position. So it happens at anything.
Which is a good thing for those of you listening to know if you're going into the .com world, because
Well,
that's not abnormal, right?
I haven't seen it like that. That's the longest interview I've ever had in my life, and I haven't had anything like that since. They can be long. I was on an interview. I had an interview that lasted about 5 hours. In my recent history. But the job I'm at now, that interview, the whole interview process, and I would argue was painless and was easygoing. Probably, I think the whole thing lasted between all the interviews for probably about 2 hours, and they made their decision. And in the end, I'm still with the company, and I love my team, and they love me, and and I think it
And
was.
they've promoted you and given you raises, so
I
they
am
liked
now
your
the
performance.
CEO of the world. Yes, I run everything. For those out there, I'm your boss. Yeah, no, it's been great. My point being is, like I said, my point being is, I think the interview process, independent of the interview process, uh, whether you get a good person or a bad person, has nothing to do with the interview process for the most part. And I think that the artifice of the interview process gets in the way. And I think that people should stop concerning themselves about whether the person wore a black shirt and not a collared shirt, whether they are. I just think we're moving beyond that today. I think we're getting past some of these
Well, I think
artifices.
what we want, I think the consensus that we can say is a more respectful interview process that treats the candidates who are up for the job humanely and equitably, and as
I'd go
if they are
beyond that,
valued.
but I'm looking more from a business perspective. Yes, you want to treat people humanely, but from a business perspective, that let me say that one more time. From a business perspective, that it's important that they don't. Someone made a comment that you can mistake the finger for the moon, right? And the notion is like when you point a finger at the moon, uh, and it's kind of reference to I think it's reference to a dog, where if you point at the moon, for most dogs they'll look at the finger, and they're not looking at what you're trying to actually point at, which is the moon, unless you have a pointer or what is it, a shepherd of some sort who might be able to identify what you're pointing at. Um, and I think that happens a lot in the interview process. And I think that people miss, because of the system, the way that things are set up, that you, again, will be focusing on the artifice. And that video that we watched where that woman talked about why the manager did not hire that lady because she was wearing white pumps the day after, what was it, Labor Day or Memorial Day? I don't remember what it was.
So
And
that's a bias, right? And
well, and
that's
and it's not just a bias. I mean, these are things where artifice. I went an interview at one point, and I didn't get a job at some place because this is I was wearing a black shirt and a hat, and it was a leadership position. And hey, look, historically speaking, I get it, right? Under the artifice rules of 1960, you wear your tie, your collared shirt, and that's the where we're at. And I am saying, let's get past that bullshit. Let's move on. Companies, you want the best person? Look past the bullshit. Don't look at the shoes they're wearing. Don't look at whether their
oh
husband or,
yeah.
or their girl or their wife are attractive or not. In fact, I'm going to recommend people read a book called Moneyball, which really is a fantastic book about how we as human beings are horrible at identifying the truth, and that we leverage that we live off of false, what's the word I'm looking for, signals all the time.
Oh
and
yeah,
and Moneyball, which is about Billy Bean, the manager of the A's. The movie has nothing to do with the book. The movie is a veneer of what the book is. I mean, literally a veneer. The book really gets into the concept of how we as human beings are have really bad mechanisms built into us, to actually adequately identify truth in a weird, and it gets in our way. And I'm saying, as you as a company, a startup or a large company, your interview system is fucked up. And you need to think about it, because you're probably not hiring the right person. And maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe you're able to actually, you can get along without it. You're just a check. Maybe you're just hiring for check boxes. That's a possibility. But what I'm suggesting is, like, think about your interview process. If you're a startup, or you're a smaller organization, and the person you're hiring matters, the idea that the original, the old school ideas around what mattered for the interview shouldn't matter. You want to what matters is, can they get the job done? Are they able to make the sale?
yeah.
Are they able to produce the code? Are they able to make the marketing material? Are they able to perform the heart surgery? That's what fundamentally matters. And whether they are the best performer in the interview should not matter. So what are the rules? How do you get through that? I don't know exactly. I'm just saying that
You just know that the current process is not getting there,
I don't think so.
and
I think it's
yeah,
despite the
yeah, no,
fact. I think it's
that's
despite the fact.
I agree. I agree. Do you want to hear my favorite interview story?
Sure.
This is so. I was working with a math faculty member, and we were hiring tutors for the math center. And this kid comes in, and he sits down, and we hand him the questions, and we let him look at them for about 5 minutes before we start the interview. We've got it scripted. We start going back and forth, asking him questions, and suddenly his phone rings, and he picks it up, and he's like, looks at it. He's like, "Oh, I got to take this. I got to take this." And he puts it up to his ear, and he says, "Hello." And he has a speaker on, so we can hear the whole conversation. And it's like this nurse, and she's like saying, "Hi, I'm calling from your about your medical marijuana appointment. Are you still coming to that this afternoon?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, 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 yeah." And he quickly hangs up and puts the phone away. This is before marijuana was legal in Washington State. And I was just like, "Well, if we hire you, I hope you're going to share." We did not hire him, by the way. We did not hire him for that position. That is something you should not do
Yeah, yeah.
in
Well,
the middle of an interview. Don't accept the phone call in the middle of an interview, and especially if you know it's your medical marijuana doctor with with your script.
that's hilarious. Yeah. Anyways,
Anyways, we
that's my
solved the world's
thinking.
problems
We did
again.
once again. We solved the world's problems.